okay?
Anytime.
Hello, my name is Gigi Robinson, and today's date is November 8, 2011. I'm interviewing Captain Robert Cawyer Brossett at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, about his life and military service. Captain Brossett, where were you born?
I was born in Muskogee, Oklahoma.
Did you grow up in the same area?
I grew up in Muskogee until right after kindergarten. My dad then started to progress through the Kmart Corporation, so we moved then in my childhood. I did a year in Wichita, Kansas, and then I went to school in Rogers, Arkansas until finally settled down in Rolla, Missouri in 3rd grade, and that's where I lived all the way in through until college.
Were these small towns that you were living in?
Yes, yes. Definitely not big cities by any means, so I'm small town raised.
Did you live on a farm or in a suburb?
No, not in a farm, just real small towns in the city of those towns, so yeah.
And what did you do for fun as a child?
I think I had a pretty normal childhood. I like to play with the neighborhood kids, I guess you would say. Go outside. Well, actually, my mom made it a point to go outside and ride bicycles because I also like to play video games, but I think she struck a good balance, making me go outside when it was nice out, and otherwise I like to play video games, you know, have an imagination with cars and stuff like that, and until I got older, and then I really enjoyed playing sports, and that's what I did throughout my school years.
What sport did you play?
Starting in middle school, 5th grade, throughout I played football. Starting in 7th grade, I wrestled until the rest of high school, and then I also played soccer as a kid until it started to conflict with football later on in high school.
Had to choose one over the other.
Yeah.
Huh? How old were you when you decided to go into the military?
I guess my deciding factor, if I could pinpoint a time when I really began to get serious about looking at the Army as a potential future, was after my junior year in high school. I went into a program called Missouri Boys State, and it's where selected boys throughout the state go to a campus for a week in the summer, and they learn about the government and other things like that. And they had a career day, and the on-campus ROTC recruiter was there talking about the options of the Army, and that's when I really first got the information, and it digested over my senior year in high school, and I decided to apply and look into it further.
Did you have to test into the ROTC?
Well, when you apply for ROTC, they're really looking for your scholarship, so your grades while you're in high school, your extracurricular activities, your leadership, I guess, potential through those extracurricular activities, what clubs you were in, kind of like a character. They do interviews with you, try and get a whole person concept of who you are and see if you'd be a fit, I guess, in the Army as a leader. So that's basically the interview process that they take you through.
Did you approach your parents with this before you enlisted?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, as soon as I came back from that summer camp, I began talking with my parents. Obviously, as a senior in high school, and you have you know, your future plans ahead of you. I began to discuss with my parents that option, and it was the leading option at that point for myself. And of course, they liked it because the Army was going to pay for college, and that's something that really lifted a burden off their shoulders. So in that aspect, they were pleased. But of course, like any parent, I think they had their reservations about it, mainly your safety and what it would mean in the future as far as you know, potential harmful environments and stuff like that. But
who was more worried, your mother or your father?
I would say my mother, definitely. I'm close with my mother. I would say that we have a unique relationship in the fact that I don't call my mother once a week or anything like that. We don't have a real close relationship where we're constantly talking. As long as she knows that I'm safe, then she's fine. But as long as she doesn't know exactly what I'm doing, that's when she begins to become worried, and those motherly instincts, I guess, begin to kick in.
What is the length of the contract when you go through ROTC rather than going directly into the Army?
With an ROTC contract, your contract really depends on when the Army starts to pay for your college. For myself, they started to pay for my college at day one. I was a 4-year scholarship awardee, so in return, I had to pay back. The ROTC contract is for 8 years. But the final 4 years of that contract is done through what's called the Individual Ready Reserve, the IRR, which basically means that you can get out of the Army and serve those final 4 years with no ties to the Army, other than they can call you back if they really need you, past National Guard, past reserves, and they're taking their final step in bringing back people that had served in the Army before they go, I guess, to like a draft. But those 4 years in front of it, for me, are active duty for my contract, since that's what they paid for my school. However, if there's a person that got a 3-year scholarship or a 2-year scholarship, then that's their active duty contract, or if they went into the reserves or National Guard, that contract for them.
So then for them it would be 3, 3, and 3?
It would be a 3-year active duty and a 5-year individual ready reserve. This is my understanding of it. I'm not going to say that is completely true, because I really only know 100% for myself, but I'm pretty sure that's how it works for the rest of the ROTC cadets and their contracts.
You went to university first. What did you study? What was your major?
My major was criminal justice in college.
And why criminal justice?
Originally, before I actually went to the university, I had decided to be a biology major. But then thinking through it further, I looked at criminal justice and thought that would be a better fit for me. I kind of had ideas at the time of possibly using it later on in my career, maybe as a degree leading up to going to law school, or possibly using it in another federal agency, FBI, CIA, something like that. And also then it allowed you to use it for local police, highway patrol, anything like that. So it seemed like a good stepping stone at the time whenever I was entering college.
You've been in for 7.5 years now between your university years and active duty, is that correct?
I did 4 years in college as a cadet, and I have been in the Army commissioned as an officer for 3.5.
Are you considering re-upping?
Well, my contract, as far as active duty, ends in May, and then I can decide to get out at that time if I'd like, or I can continue on. And as an officer, you don't necessarily re-enlist and sign up for another continued amount of time. You just continue to serve until you decide to get out. Now, there are things that you do in the Army that add on additional years. If you go to a school to continue your education or anything like that, then that will add additional years to your service, your obligation. Right now, what I'm currently seeking to do is go to law school through the Army. It's called the FLEP program, the Funded Legal Education Program, and I'll find out about that in about a month's time. And if I am selected, about 70 to 100 people usually apply, and up to 25 can be selected, but it just depends on the applicants and how many they decide to select. But if I get selected, then I'd go to law school, which is typically 3 years, and then you repay back with service in the Army as a JAG officer.
If you're not selected, what are you going to do?
Undecided. Then I have to make a decision. I'd more than definitely go past my original contract. I'd go past May, just because after I find out from FLEP, if I don't get in and I do decide to get out, it's really not enough time to do all the necessary things to really get out of the Army at that point. But I'm really unsure if I would get out or stay in. I just haven't decided yet, and a lot of that, I mean, the main point is whether or not I get into the FLEP program, and then I'd make my decision after those results.
I understand that basic training for ROTC cadets is slightly different for enlisted men.
Right.
Can you explain to me what the difference is?
Well, for a regular person who just enlists into the Army, they go to basic training and their AIT, which teaches them their specific job in the Army, their MOS. And that's, I guess, what the general concept of the American people have whenever they think of basic training and someone entering the Army. The drill sergeant yelling at the trainee and everything like that. With an ROTC cadet that's just going in right from college, it's a little bit different. You do typically your freshman and sophomore year of college, and you're just in a classroom kind of learning what the Army is. You know, very basic instruction, what, you know, the ranks are, how the Army organization is built up and how it works and functions. And then throughout that time in college, you're also getting like labs would work for any other class. You're getting labs in your military science classes where you, I mean, essentially go out and play Army, and you learn tactics and techniques and stuff like that. And then really the culminating event for a cadet comes after their junior year, in between their junior year and senior year, when they go to a leadership camp in Washington at Fort Lewis, and it's around 30 days of training that would, I guess, give you the same soldier skills that another person in the Army would have gotten through basic training. And then once you actually commission into the Army and you have your branch, for instance, I'm an engineer, then you go to officer basic course, and that's when they teach you your specific skills as an engineer or military police, infantry, that the other soldiers are getting during their AIT.
Since your degree is in criminal justice, I'm wondering how you ended up in an engineer company.
Yes.
Could you explain that for me?
Well, when you commission, and as an ROTC cadet, you put the 16 branches in a wish list, essentially, number 1, number 2, all the way down, and you list what branch you would like most, and all the way down to the least. And for me, I wanted the Corps of Engineers. I wanted to be an engineer officer. And you're basically put on an OML, an order merit list, as a cadet with all the other cadets in the country. And they base that off of your GPA, your physical training, your APFT score, and they have a matrix that they use, and they basically spit out a final score for you, and you're ranked with all the other cadets in the country. And then they start from the top of the list and start to give out the branches, starting with the first person. So the first person is going to get their first choice, and they kind of fill the list starting at the top, and they just don't go completely down because they want to kind of give, you know, I guess, good officers to all the branches. So they start at the top, but they don't fill up each branch all the way. They save a little bit of space and then start to work down your list, first, second, third, fourth, and then finish filling out the branches in that way. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. Thank you. What is the APTF?
The APFT stands for the Army Physical Fitness Test, and that's you get a score based on your physical fitness. And actually, right now, the Army is in the process of changing the physical fitness and the way that you are, scored. The events are actually changing. The whole Army fitness program actually is changing for the Army right now, and it's being implemented right now. They're actually doing the beginning stages of that for new enlistees that are coming into the Army now, are actually going through this new Army fitness program, and they're doing the final steps to develop the new program. So it hasn't been released Army-wide exactly how this new test is going to look and what the scores are going to be and everything like that. But the old Army PT test, which I've grown up with, is 2 minutes of push-ups, 2 minutes of sit-ups, and a 2-mile run, and you're scored based on how you do in each of those events.
Has anyone informed you why they're making these changes?
Well, the Army constantly studies everything that it's doing. Obviously, like any organization, they want to make themselves better. And so the Army set out years ago to find out how to better prepare themselves physically. As you know, the last decade we've been an Army at war. And there have been many voices in the Army that have said the PT test as it's currently set doesn't make sense to soldiers downrange. We need to change the way we do PT to make it better for ourselves downrange. So that's essentially what they did. They studied how they could make PT today better for the soldier when it really matters, and that's downrange. So that's really, I believe, what set this in motion and the driving force behind it.
When you say downrange, you mean on the battlefield?
Yes, in theater, currently in Afghanistan and drawing down in Iraq.
What did you do immediately after you were commissioned? Did you go for more training? Were you in charge of a squad? What happens next?
I had a bit of a unique experience for myself personally. Usually, a newly commissioned lieutenant would go straight to the officer basic course and begin their training to learn the skills that's going to make them an officer in whatever branch they were selected in. For me, immediately after being commissioned, I actually went to LTC, the Leadership Training Center at Fort Knox, which is a training facility for cadets that entered the program late. So instead of coming into the program as freshmen, they enter as sophomores, and so they're a year behind, and so they do go to this summer camp to really catch up. And I actually worked as a cadre member at that camp, teaching these cadets leadership skills, essentially. And that's what I did at first for about 3 months before I went to my training after that.
When you say leadership skills, are you talking intellectual or physical? Are we talking weapons training?
It really varies. What I was working at specifically was at a rope course, and it served as a confidence builder, really to work as a team and come up to your fears and learn how to get over them. You give them obstacles that they have to figure out as a group, how to solve the problem, how to work together to get through it. You can see the camaraderie as one person will struggle with a particular event on the confidence course, and the others really pushing them through, getting them to do things that they wouldn't normally do. So that's what I did in particular, but also other parts of that course were, like I said, playing Army earlier, talking about ROTC. You set them up in mock training or mock events where you give them a scenario where they're going to knock out a bunker, and they have a squad of soldiers, and they rotate. So one person will be the leader for this particular lane, for this particular exercise. So they have to develop the plan, they have to execute, they have to tell the other squad members exactly what they're doing. They have to give them orders, to put themselves in the right placement, to make movement, engage the enemy. All of those things are put into motion, and it teaches them, in a pressure situation, those skills and attributes, I guess.
So, as well as leadership skills, you're also describing to me what I would call group cohesion, and you find that this works well, the type of exercises that have been developed up to this point, the ones you were working with?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, it's not a new concept in the Army. anyone, I guess, that's been through basic training can attest to it as well. I mean, they break you down as an individual at basic training, and then to grow you up as a group. And it's the same kind of things that you see in the Army that I experienced. Yeah.
Speaking of building as a group, when you were in basic training, did you have to go through the CS gas chamber?
Yes, the CS gas chamber, the first time that I went through, very memorable experience. Won't say it was a pleasant experience, but necessary. I mean, obviously, it teaches you to trust your equipment. You go into the gas chamber with your equipment all on and in place, and you're breathing and everything's fine. And as soon as you break the seal and take off your equipment and that CS gas hits you and your body naturally reacts to it, you learn really quickly to trust your equipment and know that it's going to, potentially save your life in that situation.
Do you clear your mask after you've resealed it? Do you clear it while you're in the chamber?
Yes, you do. There's many different things that they do in the CS gas chamber, but that's one of the things they teach you to do is how to clear your mask. You actually break the seal and then reestablish the positioning, clear your mask, and then you can continue to breathe normally. And then at the end of your time in the chamber, that's when they actually have you remove your mask completely and have the gas hit you and you breathe in, and then you get the effects of the CS gas. I've
heard that some soldiers, when they're in the chamber, have to repeat certain phrases or their name and their rank.
Yes.
Did you have to do that as well?
Yes. I think my particular task was to come to the middle, say my full name, and then begin to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And as I remember, I did not get very far before I was no longer able to speak.
What's it like when they finally let you out into the fresh air?
Well, you're happy to be outside, definitely, but it doesn't make it any less painful for a while. It's no joke. It stays in your eyes and on your skin for a while until finally all the fresh air gets it out of your system. But it's definitely a great thing to see those doors open.
Was there anything in particular besides the CS gas that you found really challenging in basic training?
Well, like I said, for LDAC, for the cadets, going through the last 10, well, not the very last 10 days of the training, but the last big exercise that you do is 10 days straight in the field, where you work as a squad and you do all these exercise. They're called sticks lanes, squad training exercise lanes, where you go through and you do these scenarios. And those 10 days in the field, close to your buddy, are definitely memorable events that you remember for the rest of your life, and working through challenging things like that really build your character. It's something that I'll remember for the rest of my life.
You've been with several units. Who were you with when you went to Iraq? Is that correct?
Yes.
Who were you with at the time?
Well, after I completed Officer Basic Course, my training there, I did some additional training, went to airborne school, actually got to go back to my home university and do 2 weeks of hometown recruiting. And then I went to meet up with my unit. I was assigned to the 5th Engineer Battalion. They were deployed at the time already to Iraq, and they had been there, I want to say 12 or 13 months already. So I deployed to meet them in Iraq, and I got there, and they were essentially already wrapping up their deployment once I got there. They did 2 more months while I was there, and then they actually redeployed, and I stayed in Iraq to serve with the follow-on battalion that took over their footprint, the missions that they were doing, and took a spot as a platoon leader with that follow-on battalion.
Was it difficult for you to establish your authority with a new group? Soldiers who didn't really know you?
Right. Well, essentially, it was as if I were joining that unit as a new second lieutenant. Since I was new to the 5th Engineer Battalion, it was really the same experience 2 months later, again, just being the new lieutenant at the 37th Engineer Battalion. But I think I had the same challenges that any new lieutenant will have whenever they get to their platoon. Mine just happened in Iraq in a deployed environment. I will say the one thing that I really missed out on in that particular situation was that I didn't get to serve as their platoon leader all the way for the train-up leading up to the deployment. So for that whole time, they had a different lieutenant as they were getting their group really to start working together, really to develop their tactics and their techniques and the procedures that they were going to use in deployment, and then I'm the new guy that's taking over once they finally get to the deployment. So that was the one different and difficult situation that I was dealt in that situation.
Did you have any trouble establishing trust with them because of it?
I would say it made them more, and this is like every soldier in a platoon when they meet their new platoon leader. They're going to be hesitant at first. They're trying to fill them out in their leadership style, just like they're going to fill the leader's going to feel out their soldiers. But I think it really is. It comes to your personality, how you react with people. It's really your skills with people at that point. And I think some of the things that I did worked well for me. Getting to know them as people, first establishing those relationships, and getting to know how they did their job and what really made them tick, and connecting with them on that level before we ever had to do missions outside the wire, and I was giving them orders and those things.
Was your equipment already on the ground when you arrived then?
Yes. It's theater provided equipment. The equipment at that time, it stays from unit to the next unit whenever they take over. We weren't taking over our own equipment. The majority of the equipment stayed here in the States. You took over some of your equipment, but all of the MRAPs, the mine-resistant vehicles that guard against the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices and stuff like that, all stayed in country with the remaining units that would fall in on that gear, that equipment.
Were you part of Operation Iraqi Freedom?
Yes.
A security specialist, an international security specialist, mentioned in a report to the committees and Congress in general in 2009 that things were winding down in Iraq as America started to turn over more of the responsibilities to the Iraqi government and troops. Did you feel like that was so when you were over there?
Most definitely. My first deployment, well, my only deployment, was to Iraq in 2009, and so I didn't have the previous experience to go off of. However, I had many soldiers that were on their second and third and maybe even their fourth deployment that knew how things operated beforehand. But I got in country in May, and June 30th of 2009, there was a big change in the way things operated in Iraq as far as handing over authority to the Iraqi people. And just being there in those 2 months, I saw a big change, let alone being there in previous deployments. So you could definitely see the effects of, I guess, the drawdown or the transfer of authority that was happening at that time.
Was it creating more stability?
Yes. I mean, there were stability operations in what we were doing. You hear the term winning the hearts and minds a lot, and actually one of the mission sets that we were given as a platoon were doing CERT projects, which stands for the Commander Emergency Response Program. And essentially what that program did, using U.S. funds and also Iraqi funds, you paid Iraqi contractors to improve their civil capacities to make life better for the Iraqi people. For instance, we would be charged with finding a contractor and paying them to build a route or a road from one town to another, so that those two towns would then be connected, and they would have free transportation to make their lives better. That's just one example. Improving their water sources, anything like that. So yes.
What kind of materials were you using to build those roads? Because it's so hot there in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Arizona would be here.
Right. Well, I mean, you use the same materials that you use here. It's just a little bit harder to get a hold of, but you use rock for your base, and then it depends really on the road. If you're in the middle of nowhere, you're not going to build an asphalt road. You're just going to build an improved road of just rock that's stable and won't wash away. So it really depended on the area, the particular mission, the construction site, what was available, and what it really needed to, what the purposes of that road were for. So it really depended, but you had all assets available. It just depended on whether or not it was absolutely necessary.
You mentioned water supply. Were you actually developing new supplies of water, or were you just improving the ones that they had?
The platoon, me and my platoon, we weren't engaged in any of the water missions, I guess you would say. But I know a sister platoon, they were given the mission of going out and doing reconnaissance on all of the irrigation and the canals that were in our particular area of operation, and finding out, if they were serviceable, if not, what needed to be done to make them serviceable, basically how that entire system could be made better to make water more available to more Iraqis, how the water needed to be treated. All of those things were being done at the time.
Did you work on buildings or more roads?
We were a horizontal light equipment platoon, and horizontal construction meaning doing route improvements mainly. A vertical construction platoon would be more into actually building buildings. So we were mainly route repair. The construction projects that we did ranged from doing rapid crater repair. So if a unit had been traveling down a road and an IED did go off, then we could come in behind that unit to repair the road, and make it serviceable again where you could travel down. Building berms for force protection on a fob, entry control point, making an entry into a fob, building up, things like that. Those were primarily the things that we were doing construction-wise.
So you were working both on the forward operating base and with civilian populations to improve their lives as well.
Right. And mainly for us, when we were out working in this with civilians, it was mainly as a quality assurance, quality control piece. We were just watching over the Iraqis that were doing the construction, and since we were paying them money from both our government and the Iraqi government, we had a vested interest in making sure they were doing it correctly. So that's exactly what we would do. We would go and check up on them at different points in the construction. Say they were 25% of the way done, we would go out at that time, pay them 25% of the money, let's say, and make sure that they were doing it according to the scope of work. If it was a road, then we made sure that they were building that road correctly.
How did they respond to American oversight? Were there any difficulties?
Well, like I said, they were getting paid from us, and so this was producing jobs for them. So obviously they were pleased, and the process of, they had to bid for the construction projects, and so they made their best case, and we picked a contractor that best suited, the government, both monetarily, their past works, what made the most sense. And so it was always a positive reaction that I got from the contractors. If they were doing something wrong and we called them on it, we always had the documentation in the contract saying, this is what you agreed to do, and you're not doing it. So either you correct it or you're not getting paid any more money, and that made things work, pretty quickly.
Did you have interaction with other civilians just beside the construction crews?
Yes, absolutely. When we would go on a reconnaissance mission, say we would get a mission that says, well, down the road we're going to do a route improvement here. Well, then we would have to go out and look at that road, see what needed to be done, and basically get eyes on, see the lay of the land and all of that. Well, while we were out there, I mean, this is along people's land where they live, so they would come out, they would see Americans. We would stop. I had an interpreter that went out with me on all these missions, and we would stop and talk to the local people. It was a very good way to get a feel of how activity was in that area. Were there any enemy in the area? And mostly, most of my experiences with the civilians in those situations were positive. They saw the American people, and I will say in my case, as a way that things were going to get better. The one thing that you had to be careful of was they wanted you to do much more than what you were already doing. They wanted you to make everything better, and you had to avoid from making promises. You had to state very specifically what you were there to do. That way they didn't get in their minds that you were going to do something more and that you wouldn't fulfill that promise and then turn something that was a positive into a negative.
Were you under physical threat in general
Well,
from opposing fire? Did you ever experience that?
I personally was never fired upon by enemy, and we never fired upon any enemy. But every time you left the wire, the FOB, and went out to do these recon missions to a construction site or anything, there was always the very real possibility of being hit by an IED or being ambushed by an enemy threat. So the threat was always very real, and you can say whether it was luck or good TTPs or whatever it was. During my time with my platoon and traveling as much as we did, because we did go out very frequently, we just never encountered any direct enemy contact, and I'm very thankful for that.
When you went out any distance, real distance beyond the wire, did you have increased protection, other troops, units to watch your back?
Well, any time that we left the FOB, we had our MRAP vehicles that protected, are built to protect you from IEDs. We were very self-sufficient. Whenever we left, we had enough people and enough equipment essentially to take care of ourselves. Now, if we were to ever come into contact with the enemy, we had the means to call for further help, but just leaving on our own, we had the equipment and the personnel to take care of ourselves. I will say from a technical aspect, like we talked about earlier, I'm just a criminal justice major doing very technical engineer things, so we did use Air Force engineer officers that are very technically spun up on the things that we were dealing with, and we would embed those into our platoon, have them go out with us on the missions to provide that technical expertise where I lacked it, or where the NCOs in my unit lacked the necessary expertise.
Speaking of embedding, when President Bush, the son, was in office, he always used that phrase referring to journalists. We're going to embed them. Mm-hmm. Did you have journalists there in your area of operation?
Well, I was at Joint Base Balad for the majority of my time in Iraq, which is a really large compound in Iraq. And so I have no doubt in my mind that there were media personnel on that base at all times. But I never had a journalist embedded with my platoon at any point during that time.
What was the best part of your experience over there?
The best part of my experience, definitely hands down, were working with the soldiers in my platoon. That's an experience that I will never forget. I wish I could do over again. You hear a lot of officers say that platoon leader is the best job in the Army, and up to this point I have not been able to find a job that exceeds it. My only wish is that it would have lasted longer. It's just you get such a satisfaction from leading, in my case, 33 soldiers through that environment and looking back at your successes and building those relationships. I mean, you are really a team. You only have your brothers to lean on in those situations. And I still talk to quite a few of those soldiers. They're guys that I would, sacrifice again for in many ways if I could, or if they ever called upon it. And I have no doubt that they would do the same for me. And having those relationships, if I walked out of the Army tomorrow, would be the memories that I held on to, definitely.
From the way you talk, I'm wondering, did you have any female soldiers in your platoon?
I had a female medic in my platoon for a time. Not for the entire time, but for, I'd say, about half the time that I was the platoon leader there. But that was the only female soldier in my platoon. And I can only think of one other female that was in the company, and she was a supply sergeant.
How did the men seem to respond to working with them?
I didn't see any difference given to the female soldiers that I mentioned. Like I said, there were only a few of them, so I didn't see much of a difference at all. I can see in how a female may be treated in different environment, in like an infantry platoon, if a female would be in that situation, or if we would have had multiple females that were actually serving as in our platoon. I can see how there would be different, how they would have been treated differently. But in my particular situation, I just didn't come upon anything.
As an officer, can you tell me if there are any regulations regarding male and female relationships in a combat zone?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's standard procedures when you're downrange in Afghanistan or Iraq, that a male soldier and a female soldier aren't supposed to be in, say, one or the other's room together, with the door closed, for instance, or without other soldiers around. You don't want there to be that additional stuff in their relationship. I mean, it's just like a normal work environment in the civilian world. A lot of companies will say no dating between their employees just because they don't want that to cause any problems in the office. Well, it's the same in a combat environment. You don't need anything extra to cause anything more stressful than what we already have to deal with.
What kind of penalties would there be for breaking those regulations, those rules?
I'm not sure. It's usually spelled out very specifically in the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, what the penalties could be, both the minimum and the maximum. I don't know off the top of my head, but let's just say it would be strong enough to where, I mean, obviously the purpose of any punishment is to keep a person from doing it beforehand, knowing what would happen. So hopefully it worked. I never had a problem with it in my unit. So
let's move forward a little bit. What unit are you with now?
Once I completed my platoon leader time with the 37th in Iraq, I then redeployed back to Fort Leonard Wood and rejoined the 5th Engineer Battalion, who I originally met in Iraq, and I have been serving with them ever since.
Has all of your service been with the 1st ID, the big red one?
The 5th Engineer Battalion falls under the 1st ID. The 37th Engineer Battalion does not. So I've served originally in Iraq with the 1st ID with the 5th Engineer Battalion, and I'm serving again with the 1st ID now that I'm back with the 5th Engineer Battalion.
The mission for the 4th MEB has recently changed from Homeland Security and natural disaster response to pre-deployment. How do you feel about going over again?
I have no problem if my name is called to go to deploy again. Right now, in the 5th Engineer Battalion, our battalion has always remained available to deploy, and currently we have 3 companies that are deployed, while the battalion headquarters has stayed at Fort Leonard Wood along with some of the other companies that fall under us. However, if it's my duty to go over there again, I would gladly do it. The way I explain it to people sometimes whenever they ask is, whenever you're in garrison, it's like being on a sports team and you're practicing for the game. When you're deployed, you're in the game. That's your culminating experience. So everything we do while we're not deployed is to ready ourselves for when we finally do get deployed. For me, I'm in the Army. I know that was a possibility when I signed up. So if I get called to deploy, then I'm going to do it, and I'm not going to have a problem with that.
Are you married?
I am.
Were you married before you went on your first deployment?
I was.
How did your wife deal with that?
We met in college. I was already an ROTC cadet when we started to date. Before I proposed, I mean, we had long discussions on what a future together would mean. I tried to very specifically tell her of, all the possibilities that would happen. And so when we got married, she knew what she was getting into as far as deployments and the hardships of a marriage while being in the Army. So she was more than supportive. She's still supportive to this day. She's the one person whenever I'm discussing all the things that I want to do in the future if I decide to get out of the Army, she's always stood behind everything I bring up. If I get out, she'll be there. If I stay in, she'll be there. So she's definitely a supportive person that I lean against.
Who does she lean against when you're deployed?
Well, luckily for us, Fort Leonard Wood, where I was stationed, so where we were living before I deployed, is 30 minutes from where I went to high school. And so my parents, my sister still live there. And she is also from Missouri, from Hannibal, Missouri, which is 3.5-hour drive. So when I was deployed, she had my family and her family right there that she was able to lean on to use as outlets, I guess, for frustration or when she had any problems. But the one thing I will say that I think is the biggest help is her being actively employed and having a job. I always think it's dangerous if, especially in our case when we don't have children, if the other person doesn't have a job and they're just sitting at home, kind of, just thinking about what's going on. So I think that was the biggest help, was the fact that she had a job to kind of take her mind off of things and give her friends to lean on as well.
Does she participate in any kind of service for wives and families of military men on the base?
Well, I will say that she's a part of the FRG. Every company has a family readiness group where there's the group of spouses, wives, husbands, and other family members when a unit's deployed, that they come together during holidays, during regular scheduled events, to come together and talk and comfort each other. She was a part of the FRG. She would have someone to call if she ever needed anybody. As far as taking on an active leadership role, she hasn't done that, but she was plugged in, I guess you would say.
So is her work with the FRG her career, or does she have an outside career as
No,
well?
she is a dental assistant. Her normal day job is at a dental office, and being a part of the FRG, she was just a member. She didn't have an active role in that or anything.
Before we close, I'd like to know, is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like Americans to know? Anything about your civilian life or your military service?
I would just say that I was, I guess, honored, you would say, to be asked to be interviewed. I didn't think that I have anything special that anyone would be interested to hear about. I consider myself a regular person, just like any other person out there working a job. However, the Army for me isn't just a job, and I don't think it should be for anyone. It's more than just a job. It's a way of life. It's a specific culture in many aspects, and it shouldn't be just a job. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do the things I have in the Army, and whether I stay in or get out, it's meant a lot to me, and I will remember a lot of it. I think it'll only help me if I do decide to get into the civilian world and do another job. And I think civilians should realize that soldiers are just like them. They're regular people. They're citizens of this country. They've just decided to take an oath to the Constitution and fight for our freedoms. And I'm still to this day very amazed at how many times, if I'm in a uniform in public, how often I get my hand shaken and I'm told thank you. It means a lot. I thank people who do it, and I would only say don't forget those who've gone before us, because if it wasn't for those veterans before us, I mean, we couldn't do what we do. The veterans from Vietnam, for example, didn't have the same reaction whenever they came back as we do, and I really look towards those veterans with a deep respect, because I believe that they had it much harder than we did. But other than that, like I said, I don't think my story is very interesting, but I hope someone learned something.
Well, I thank you so much for sharing your story with us. On behalf of myself, my family, Ball State, and our project, I'd like to thank you for your military service to our nation. I appreciate it.
It's been my honor.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks.